Hello, everyone, and welcome to A New Direction. My name's Jay Izzo, and oh, man, he's back for part two. Steve Riddle, his book, Falling into Leadership. How Leaders Emerge, Grow, and Lead with Purpose is the name of the book, along with Kath Riddle, which I think is your mom. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it was your mom. And but it's a fabulous book. I had to bring him back because we only got through about half of the book. We hit on a little bit of some of the other parts of the book, but there's so much more that Steve could talk about that's related to the book. And I wanted to bring him back. First of all, I just really liked him a lot, and we just kind of hit it off. And sometimes you have a guest where you just have a chemistry and a connection. And Steven and I just really had that. And I'm hoping, we were both just talking before the show, that hopefully we get an opportunity to actually give each other a hug and hang out a little bit and do that. So I'm looking forward to it. Let me just say some things here about leadership before we get in with Steve. When it comes to leadership, we tend to look at outcomes only. And sometimes what happens when we look at outcomes only, what happens is we get to, well, I'm good enough. And we never get to great. And the reason that is because oftentimes people bring the same thing that they ever, these leaders will come into companies and they'll bring the thing that they made them successful at some other company, and they think it'll work at another company. And what they do is they get it to a certain point and it's pretty good, but they never know what really great can be because they never are willing to adjust or pivot from what they currently believe. And part of this is because what happens is we start getting enamored with our own previous success. And so we believe that our previous success should just automatically mean that we're going to be successful somewhere else. And we can be, but maybe not to the level that we could be. And there's things that we miss out on that we're not talking about, like, the importance of the hard conversation. And by the way, there's a right way to have it and a wrong way to have it. Right? I mean, yeah, there's difficult conversations out there. We all have those. But here's the problem. So many of us, when we have difficult conversations, as leaders, we just blow the person out of the water, and like we're a battleship, and then we're just towing along people who are all blown up. Right? And that really doesn't get us anywhere, ultimately. And there's a number of little things like that occur when it comes to leadership that we just don't pay attention to, and we leadership is lonely. We talked about, I had a guest on last week. We talked about how generally the public is lonely, right? But when it comes to leaders, we're really lonely, right? So we're going to talk through some of these issues that are going to go from good to great. Yeah, I know that's not an original title because James Collins did it. But the fact of the matter is, if you've fallen into leadership, do you want to be good or do you want to be great? Because if you want to be good, well, you could probably do that. But if you want to be great, then that's going to require some work. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is how do we become great? Steven Riddle, my friend, is a leadership coach, mentor, advisor with 16 years of coaching experience, more than 30 years of leadership experience across Australia. You'll hear that in his lovely voice, which I would let him read the side of a cereal box, by the way, and find it endearing. As the founder of Coach Station, Steve works with executives, business owners, senior leaders who want to lead with greater capacity, competence, and influence. His coaching practice is built on the belief that leadership is a skill that can be developed, not a personality trait that you either have or you don't. He's coached hundreds of leaders in a wide range of industries. The book I just talked about, Falling into Leadership, co-written with his mom, Kath Riddle, or mum, I think they say there, is his first book, but a great one for sure. Readers have been seeing the benefits of the book by applying the learning from the book in practice with comments that offer perspective. We've already had people comment. There's already been a question that came in through LinkedIn earlier today that we tried to answer. So, you know what? He's awesome. And he lives in Brisbane, Australia. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show. Welcome back, Steven Riddle. Welcome back to New Direction, brother.
Jay, lovely to see you again. Fantastic to catch up too on a personal and professional level. So thanks for coming back and for version 2. Looking forward
Yeah,
to it very much.
for part two, as sometimes they say. Um, I thought it was interesting. You wrote me and you said, here's a few topics I'd like to talk about. And the first one was difficult conversations, which I started the show with, and specifically why leaders rehearse these conversations endlessly and still do not have them at all sometimes, or poorly. Um, and yet it's something every founder and leader needs. I don't care how small or how big the company is, and they've either avoided it or handled it badly. So let's talk about the difficult conversations, because these are critical from going from good to great in a company. Because if we avoid them, then nothing gets solved, and there's resentment. If we do them poorly, you build resentment and people quitting. So let's break down difficult conversations.
So I think when we talk about difficult conversations, for me, it's look, all of these things are very complex. So to talk about it, and we'll probably cover 3 or 4 or 5 points, and to make it, isolating it to that number is probably incorrect. But there are some key themes that I've identified and seen across industries, across different levels of seniority. And honestly, I focus a lot on accountability, and that's not just because a decade ago or 15 years ago or 30 years ago, I recognized that accountability was a good theme from a marketing point of view. It really was just a common theme that came across my desk, so to speak, when I was leading teams, and certainly as a coach. I've seen accountability become a bit of a problem. You mentioned loneliness before, but yeah, there's a loneliness epidemic we keep reading about. I think there's an accountability epidemic as well. And
That's a
the
great
challenge for leaders and managers is that often they hope that things improve. And a couple of years ago, with a client, just off the cuff, I came up with an expression, just flew out, and I've used it many times since. But blind hope's not a strategy. And the reality is that if we want things to be different, we have to change things. If you want different, you must do different. And to do different, you must know different. So learning and reading and listening to podcasts such as your great pod, and reading books and so on are very important. But in themselves, they're just knowledge gain. And I don't downplay that. You need to learn more and know more to be able to do differently, which is absolutely true. But the action and the accountability and the process of translating that into your world is something I don't know. I can't put a finger on why, but I think we're getting worse at this. I'll go back to something you said in the introduction briefly as well. Part of what you were describing there is what's often referred to in organizations as best practice. And I rail against that, not because finding a way that works for you and your organization or team is wrong, but the assumptions that we make and the almost automatic project management and process improvement systems that I see that then say, hey, we've found best practice over here. Now let's apply it over here. And it often ends up being a round peg in a square hole. So I think it's about having a broad range of skills, different capabilities, the opportunities to improve things. And you said good to great, depending on what great looks like. And again, if we're going to be tackling difficult conversations, we need to know what we're aiming for. And that's as an individual and as a team and as a leader, your expectations, the individual's expectations, the organization's expectations, KPIs, all those things that we measure. But often we do miss the obvious, which is if we want to move from A to B, so from good to great, we need to have a pretty clear idea about what great looks like. And I don't hear too many conversations in my world where people define these things that clearly. And so, as a result, one of the things that happens is it feels like it's a difficult conversation.
Mm.
It feels hard because we're not really sure what we're aiming for. We haven't earned the right to have that conversation. And as I said, blind hope's not a strategy. So that's maybe 3 or 4 things that stand out when you're talking about it. Critical, absolutely crucial to leadership and organization and team success. But these are skills that need to be developed and not just read about or hope, as I said.
Well, so let's dig into accountability for a second, because that is part of the difficult conversations I think some folks do have. Both sides. I think leaders don't have the correct accountability conversations. I think there is still, even though we say it over again, I think there is still a misunderstanding what accountability really is. Because I think the employee or the, is afraid of it when they hear it. When I hear certain people say it, it makes me cringe because I know that how I define, and I believe that how you define accountability shouldn't make us cringe. It should make us at least a little excited to go, oh, I'm going to get some help. But that's not how accountability is typically viewed. It's viewed as this is going to be a whipping session.
Yes.
So let's break down accountability. Let's define it the right way, and let's talk to people about, okay, how do we practice it?
Yeah, I think accountability. It's interesting how my mind works. Sometimes I think of these things a bit like you say, good to great. Well, we need to know what good is, what it is now, and what great is, what we're aiming towards. Accountability is a bit the same. Accountability to what? And it seems so obvious, but honestly, a lot of the things that we talk about, and I've listened to many of your podcasts, and the books that I read, and people say it to me in coaching all the time. It's not rocket science. They'll say, "Gee, this is quite simple stuff, isn't it?" I say, "Yeah, look, we're not reinventing the wheel here.
Right.
What we're trying to do is help you to understand how to be better." So people know what tennis looks like. People watch people play tennis; they know the concept, but that doesn't make you a good tennis player.
Right.
So if we're thinking about accountability, we need to know what exactly we're aiming for. And as we spoke about briefly in the first podcast, and highlighted in a whole chapter of the book, Falling into Leadership, the Riom model is an accountability model. But what it is an expectations and accountability. How am I going? Expectations and accountability model. And the reality is that if we're not really clear about what's expected in the first place, and we gain that agreement and understanding from the individual, then there's no chance in hell that they're ever going to be accountable to something that wasn't either understood or agreed to in the first place. And so we then hold people accountable retrospectively, and we get frustrated about the fact we've told them and they didn't do it. And we end up with a gap between intention and reality and all these things. And then that's why it feels like a difficult conversation, to circle back to that point, because it is difficult because we're now not talking about the same thing. We're now talking about an expectation that was clear for me, maybe as the manager, but certainly wasn't clear or agreed to by the employee, team member. And now we're worried or wondering why they continue to let us down in terms of their performance or behaviors and all the things that we measure, and so we should. But there's a gap there. And once you get that gap between intention and reality, and that can be for an individual or from one person to another, you've got a world of hurt. And that's where accountability almost always fails. And there's a lot of other layers. As I said, we're simplifying a complex thing. But I would say with some certainty that if we can get clearer in the first place and have regular update meetings about prioritization. Here's the 3 or 4 things I'm focusing on this week. Does that sit with your priorities? Is that consistent with what you want me to do? This is what I believe I'm owning. So we let people do their job. When we get that agreement, and then in one-on-ones, we talk in more detail about how that's going and the challenges along the way and my development needs and your support as my leader. All of those things become part of the ecosystem of accountability. And if we're not having or creating the opportunities to have those discussions very quickly on a Monday morning for 5 minutes, what's this week about? What was last week about? And then one-on-ones regularly to reinforce that in terms of skills, capability, relationships, and so on, then we go, inevitably there has to be gaps. And then we start talking about difficult conversations. And that's not about today being difficult. That's about what hasn't happened in the last 3 or 6 months that now makes it feel like today is a difficult conversation. And Jay, you know why? Because it is actually a difficult conversation, because you have not earned the right for that. Yeah, it feels hard because it is hard. And so it's not about today almost always, unless there's a major crisis or someone's performance or behavior is really bad about something happened in a team meeting or with a stakeholder. But generally, we're talking about themes across a time period, not an individual event. And so these things become critical. And as I say, a lot of my clients will say, oh, I get this and I know this, but now, the translation into creating the opportunities, the systems, the processes, and the relationships to do this regularly, it's a real gap.
I vacillate on this accountability thing. Let me tell you where. We're in agreement what I think accountability is. Here's where I vacillate. I vacillate whether we can actually hold anybody accountable.
No, good one. Yep.
I'm just not sure. Do you know what I mean, Steven?
I do.
It's
100% I do.
I'm like going, can I really hold somebody accountable who's not accountable to themselves? I think you have to hold yourself accountable,
Yeah.
right? I don't know that we can hold people accountable, because I think this is where, it rubs me wrong when I hear certain people say accountability. It doesn't when you say it, because I know what you mean. But when I hear certain people say it, yeah, I'm like going, "Oh, this is not gonna be good."
Mm.
We're having an accountability session. What does that mean, right? What for me, it's 3 questions, right? What went right? What went wrong? What could we do better? And how can I help you at the end? Right? It's my simplified version of an accountability session, right?
Mm.
And it's a very simple thing. I learned that from the military people that I've hung around with and I've interviewed on the show. And because it's a very simplified way of going, okay, that's accountability, right? What went right, right? Start with something positive. What's gone right so far? What's gone wrong? And then what can we do to make this better? How can you make this better, right? To me, that's simplified accountability, very simplified. But I don't know. I don't know. Again, Stephen, I vacillate on this whole accountability thing, and I think these conversations are difficult because I think this is just my opinion. You tell me if I've missed it, but I think sometimes these conversations get difficult only because they haven't been had. Because if
Mm.
they'd had the conversations from the very beginning, as you said, have set the expectations clearly, right? Then the conversations aren't so difficult. But I think the longer these conversations are put off, right? Avoidance, then we have to have them because we know we have to have them. Now the conversation becomes much more difficult. To me, that's how I see it. Maybe you have a different thought.
No, I've got about 10 things floating around in my head that I want to talk about, so I'll try and articulate this clearly. These things are scalable. And one of the great challenges you said earlier about we both talked about the loneliness epidemic. There's
Right.
certain things certainly in Australia, I think America is very similar. We seem to be on the same path, similar timeline. Um, I feel like that there's a lot of things that are talked about now through the nature of technology and social media and access that are very binary, very black and white.
Mm.
And yeah, if you're either with me or against me, you agree with me or you don't agree with me, and there's no grey. And honestly, the world is full of grey. These
Yeah.
things, often the answer is it depends, and the
Right.
circumstances matter, the mood matters, the relationship you've got matters. If as I said earlier, best practice because it worked with Johnny, it doesn't mean it's going to work with Sally. The reality is that these things have to be monitored and managed depending on the circumstance. And so where I'm going with that, I often talk about things being on a scale. And when it comes to character and integrity, they are pretty pure. I have high integrity. It doesn't mean I get everything right, but I
Right.
intend it to be the right way and the right outcome. That's good intention, good character, and integrity. So these things are pretty black and white, but the rest of the world, in my experience, is almost always pretty grey. And so where I'm heading with that is when we're talking about accountability, we can think of that if we go hard left, no accountability at all. So someone, your team and the individual has no accountability. Obviously, that's bad, right? So non-accountable cultures and individuals causes problems almost immediately, have to be addressed. It's thankfully not that common to be that extreme. If we go to the middle then, if we sort of scale it towards the middle, then we're creating environments where people feel like that they can be held accountable. And it's what you're talking about, Jay. Now, that's better than no accountability at all, but it's probably not the ideal. Because if you think about that from an action point of view, we've created an environment where people are waiting to be fed. It's that classic saying, I think I said in the first podcast, so I live my life by this, in terms of give a person a fish, feed them for a night, teach them how to fish, feed them for a lifetime. And that middle piece here is a little bit of giving the fish. So I'm waiting for you to be, as a employee team member, I'm waiting to be held accountable. It's okay. But as you said, what we're really aiming for is the other end of the spectrum there, which is people being accountable, us creating cultures where people are enabled to be accountable, not waiting to be held accountable, but they are accountable. And people, when I talk about that, go, "Wasn't that the same thing?" I said, no, it's quite different. And again, as we scale it along, there's versions of that along the way. And probably the reality for most is that we sit somewhere between the middle piece and the sort of hard right there in terms of that. And that's fine. But the more that people are enabled and feel like that they can be accountable, and this is where we use words like collaboration, enablement, yeah, all these things that we throw up, sometimes put them on a poster and hope that it becomes part of our culture. But this is actually where these things get developed. It's just like, I want you to own your role. We're paying you good money. and we're giving you every opportunity, development and my support and so on, to do the job to the best of your ability. And I'll go back to something you said there, Jay, because I want you to do your job in the best way that you can, and we'll call that great. But let's make sure that you know what great looks like as far as what I need, what the organization needs. And I absolutely want to know what you think great looks like as well. Yeah, it's not one thing. It's all of those things. That's where accountability starts to be real, because it's owned by the person who is able to be accountable, not waiting to be held accountable. Quite a different thing. Sorry, Jay, I've lost you there. I can't hear you. I don't know if others can. Sorry, Jay, I can't hear you at all, mate. I don't know if the viewers will be able to hear as well, whether that's just me. No, we've got a technical glitch. I don't know. Can you hear me still? Yeah. No, I can't hear you at all, mate. Sorry. Testing. Hello, hello. Yeah. Hello, hello. Testing, testing. Yeah, I've done that. Yeah, I've changed it to 3 different internal speakers and external. Yeah, I've tried the enhancements, the echo. Yeah, thinking that maybe something had kicked in there from a fault